And there's so much conflicting advice as well. You know, again, a lot of people that we've been responsible for treating, when they first got ill, went to their doctor and were told, "Oh, you're just depressed," or what are you complaining about? And so our culture we live in kind of supports ignoring how we feel to keep up with the status quo and what we're used to doing. And a kind of a key lesson for a lot of people in their recovery is actually that stopping trying to kind of hold on to their life and actually an acceptance of what's happening. And when I say acceptance, I don't mean giving in and saying, this is my life, I'm never going to get better from this, but actually creating an environment which is going to be supportive to recovery. That can involve some very difficult life decisions sometimes.
Yeah, and is everybody equipped to do that?
Wow. And it's, as we also we mentioned, there's so much conflicting advice, and there's, you see, if you have an illness, if you have an injury, like you break your arm or you break your leg, and people can see that, and if you can't walk because you've broken your leg and it's in a plaster, you go into work and people will offer to help you, and it's a very visible thing. With ME, it's treated with a lot of skepticism by most people. People will say, I've got chronic fatigue or ME, and people often say to them, well, I think I've got that. Well, I'm tired all the time. And they don't quite understand that there's a difference between someone that can't get through a day without having to go to bed, and the fact that, obviously many people do have a certain amount of fatigue. So people are met with so much skepticism and so much lack of understanding in the world around them that in that environment it's very difficult for people to be accepting of themselves, of what's happening. When I got ill when I was kind of 15, 16, up until that point I'd been very into sport, very active, and I defined myself a lot by being that way. And struggling to keep going at school and not able to do PE lessons, physical education. So I would have to go home and rest, where all my friends would go and play football. It was very difficult to explain to people. Yeah,
and also psychologically you have to take that on board for yourself, and that is not easy.
Yeah. In fact, that brings us to, we talked about predisposing factors and triggers, that there's a whole other section which is often very key with ME, which is the perpetuating factors. We don't get too complex here, and there's lots of different kind of parts to look at that. But just a couple of components I think are really important. One of which is, if there's been stress prior to being ill, when somebody gets ill, there's a massive new stress. And that's the stress of being ill. With an illness where no one can really tell you what's wrong with you, or certainly few people can. People are often questioning, thinking you're being lazy and kind of get on with it. And often if life was stressful before, you've still got all the same demands, but you've got no capacity to meet those demands. That's incredibly stressful for people to deal with. And then you've got the repeating questions inside of the mind of, what's wrong with me, and why is it wrong with me, and will I ever get better, and what should I do? Should I rest? Should I push myself? And all this stuff's going on in the background. And of course that drives up the nervous system. And when the nervous system drives up in that way, we're in exactly the opposite state to what we need to be able to recover and heal. To put it in the simplest terms possible, your body can either be in a stress state or it can be in a healing state. And if you're in a stress state, you're using more energy than you're building. When I say build energy, through eating food and rest and those kinds of things. If you're in a healing state, you're building more energy than you're using. So in the simplest terms possible, recovery from ME requires being primarily in a state of healing. But if we're dealing with this mysterious illness and no one can explain it and what's wrong, and I've got to pay the bills and I've got a family to support and all those stresses and anxieties, it causes people to go into what we refer to as a maladaptive stress response. So their ability to handle and tolerate stress is now nothing like what it would be in a normal person.
But you see, what is a healing state practically? How does one live in a healing state? That's a question I'm asking.
Absolutely. And it sounds like a simple question, but there's a lot to it. I think the first thing is there needs to be a place of acceptance, and there needs to be enough support in the environment that somebody is able to properly take rest. You know, and
if somebody has a job and children to look after and the general things one has in life, then what you're saying is there's almost a question of discipline, saying I have to take time during the day just to be quiet. Is this what we're talking about?
Yeah, and obviously it greatly depends upon how severely ill somebody is. You know, if someone's in a category where they can just about keep going with their life, it may be enough to take, you know, time each afternoon, for example, to rest. If someone is very severely affected, it may be, you know, a lot more drastic than that. Certainly, we found that people who can create a supportive environment and come to a place of acceptance and start to treat the underlying physical things that are going on, which maybe we'll talk about in a little bit later, that certainly creates a much more supportive environment than somebody who is still kind of struggling to keep going with what's happening and doing the various treatments, but there's no real cultivating of an inner space to actually allow that to take effect.
See, what I'm getting from what you've said so far is that people have to somehow almost do their own assessment if they think they maybe have chronic fatigue or ME at some level, whether if it's serious, well, they've already probably been to the doctor. But if they're just tired a lot of the time, which many people are, then they could take on board a lot of what you're saying. Right. They may not need to go to the doctor, but it could well be that some adjustments in their lifestyle is maybe going to prevent them from getting more seriously tired and maybe ending up with a diagnosis of ME. Yeah. And I'm just wondering what practical steps people can take on board from what you've said so far. You know, let's say the average, say, businessman or person at school, very active, housewife, doesn't matter what age they are, what should they actually do in terms of assessing their situation to see if they can make improvements?
I think it's a really good question. I think the first thing to say is that if there is more tiredness than should be there will be reasons. Yeah. So I think often what happens is people just go, oh, well, I'm just tired.
And you're saying that's not the natural state?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
I mean, if someone thinks that tiredness is not being able to do a 100-hour week, then we've got something in their expectations to be looked at.
Yeah.
But, you know, someone's doing a reasonably normal day-to-day life and they're feeling more tired than they should do, there'll be reasons. And you mentioned, and it's a very obvious thing, but it also makes a big difference, to actually listen to the body. So if somebody is at a certain time of day always feeling more tired, rather than just pushing through that, to actually listen to that. And they may even notice something as basic is they feel more tired after eating even a certain food, for example. You know, it could be a very simple thing that's going on.
So the food can trigger an allergy?
Sure. I mean, back in the 90s, it was for a while seen as potentially the answer to ME. It's a small part of it, but it could be that someone's built up an intolerance to a food, and when they eat the food, their immune system thinks that something's invading them, and therefore they have a reaction to it. I'm a great believer in people taking proper rest. You know, proper rest doesn't normally mean coming home from work and crashing on a sofa and watching loads of mindless TV. It keeps the mind very active.
And drinking beer.
You know, for anybody that doesn't believe that what we put in our mouth affects how we feel, then I encourage them to, you know, try eating a load of chocolate for a day and another day eat something, you know, some really healthy food. There is a difference. And I think nutrition has got a bit of a bad reputation because of people's resistance to the idea of changing their habits of how they feel. But so really simple things by looking at all the things that people know a lot of this stuff. You know, a lot of people know they should eat more fruit, more vegetables, all those kind of things. And of course, that in itself is not a curative treatment for ME. But in terms of managing life, decent rest, eating basically healthy food without necessarily becoming obsessive about it, and listening to our body.